My name is Nadia Calloway. I'm 31 years old. And the night of my brother's rehearsal dinner was when I finally understood that some people will only see what you carry for them the moment you set it down. The private dining room at Hargrove Hall held 42 people that evening, both families, a handful of college friends, and the wedding coordinator who had spent the last 8 months turning my brother Dominic's vision into a floor plan. The tables were set with ivory linens and low arrangements of eucalyptus and cream ranunculus that I had, in fact, helped choose, though no one at Hargrove Hall knew that detail yet. I was seated near the middle of the long center table, between my cousin Priya and an empty chair that had been assigned to Dominic's future brother-in-law, who arrived 12 minutes late and smelled faintly of the parking garage. Dominic had been speaking for about 4 minutes. He was doing the thing he always did at family gatherings, standing with one hand in his jacket pocket, the other holding a water glass he gestured with, making the whole room feel like a stage he had rented for the occasion. He was 34, 2 years older than me, and he had a way of framing even ordinary sentences so they sounded like the punchline to a joke only he fully understood. He had been talking about the wedding, about how he and his fiancée Celeste had done everything themselves, about how proud he was that they hadn't needed to lean on anyone. And then, without any shift in his tone, no warning, no wind-up, he looked at me and said, "Unlike some people at this table, who've never contributed a thing to this family and still somehow show up to every event like they earned a seat." He smiled when he said it. Not a cruel smile, exactly. More like the smile of someone who has said something they've been waiting to say for a long time and are relieved to have finally gotten it out. "She lives off us and calls it love," he added. "Always has." There was a particular quality to the silence that followed. Not the silence of a room that hadn't heard, the silence of a room that had heard perfectly and was deciding what to do with it. Celeste's mother, a woman named Patricia who wore her hair in a smooth chignon and had thus far been entirely pleasant to me, looked down at her bread plate. My own mother, seated 3 chairs to my left, made a small adjustment to her napkin. My father, who was at the far end of the table, kept his expression level in the way he always did when he had privately agreed with something he didn't want to be seen agreeing with. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip. I set it back down on the linen, precisely where it had been. I did not push back my chair. I did not look at Dominic. I found a point on the eucalyptus arrangement in front of me, and I held it. What none of the 42 people in that room knew, including my brother, was that the woman standing near the service entrance at the back of the dining room had a billing file on her tablet that accounted for every payment made against Dominic's event contract at Hargrove Hall over the past 26 months. Her name was Renata Voss. She was the venue's senior accounts manager, and she had been watching me since the moment Dominic said my name. I want to tell you how I got to that table because the table is not where the story starts. Our parents, Martin and Gloria Calloway, raised us in a 3-bedroom house in a mid-sized city that prided itself on its school district and its farmers market and very little else. My father was an electrical contractor who worked long hours and kept his feelings in a locked cabinet somewhere behind his sternum. My mother taught 2nd grade for 22 years, retired early on a knee injury, and redirected her considerable organizational energy toward managing the family's social calendar and Dominic's career trajectory, in roughly that order. Dominic was the one who got the attendance at every school play, the framed photos on the mantel, the college fund that was discussed openly at dinner. I was not neglected in any dramatic sense. I was fed, clothed, driven to appointments. But there is a difference between being provided for and being seen, and I understood that difference by the time I was 9 years old, when I won a regional writing competition, and my mother's response was to ask whether the awards ceremony might conflict with Dominic's lacrosse quarterfinal. It did not conflict. I went to the ceremony. No one came with me. I took the bus. I don't tell you this for sympathy. I tell you because it is the structural fact that explains everything that came later, why I learned to be quiet about what I accomplished, why I developed the habit of handling things without announcing them, and why, when our family's finances began to quietly deteriorate in my mid-20s, I stepped in without making it a conversation. I had studied accounting at a state university, Not the school Dominic attended on the partial athletic scholarship my parents supplemented from savings, but a perfectly solid program that I paid for myself through a combination of merit aid, a work-study position in the registrar's office, and 2 part-time jobs that I held simultaneously for 3 years. I graduated with a 3.87 GPA and a job offer from a regional firm that handled tax planning and financial review for small and mid-sized businesses. I was good at the work. I was, if I am being accurate, very good at it. Within 4 years, I had moved from junior associate to a senior analyst position with a client portfolio of my own. I also had a clear view of numbers, which meant I had a clear view of my family's numbers, and by the time I was 27, those numbers were not good. My father had taken on a large subcontracting job that went sideways when the general contractor declared bankruptcy mid-project. He was owed $94,000 that he was unlikely to recover in any reasonable time frame, and the gap between what he was owed and what he had in reserve was not a gap that my parents' savings could quietly absorb. My mother did not know the full extent of it. My father, being the person he was, had not told her. He told me because I asked. I had seen the tension in his posture for 2 months before I sat down with him at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and asked him to show me the paperwork. He did. I spent 3 hours with it. Then I made him a plan. The plan involved me covering several recurring household expenses, the mortgage supplement they'd taken on when interest rates adjusted, the utility accounts, the insurance premiums my father had quietly let slip toward their grace period, while he stabilized the contracting business and pursued the recovery claim through a construction attorney I found for him named Gerald Pratt, whose firm operated on contingency for cases with clear documentation. We did not tell Dominic. My father suggested we should, and I said no. Not because I wanted to exclude him, but because I had seen what happened when Dominic was told things that required him to feel grateful. He reframed them until he didn't have to. I had watched him do it my entire life. I didn't have the bandwidth for that particular performance on top of everything else. So I became the invisible infrastructure. Every month, a transfer from my account to the household account. Every quarter, a check to Gerald Pratt's office against the retainer I had agreed to cover. Every year, the property tax installment that my parents had always struggled to absorb in one lump sum, handled in 2 payments from my checking account before my mother had a chance to worry about it. I kept a spreadsheet. I always keep a spreadsheet. When Dominic announced his engagement to Celeste Marchetti 14 months ago, the first call he made was to my mother. The second was to Celeste's mother. The third, 2 days later, was to me, not to share the news, which I had already heard, but to ask whether I knew anything about event venues in the area, because Celeste had her heart set on something with exposed beams and good acoustics, and he didn't know where to start. I knew Hargrove Hall. I had handled the accounts for a corporate client who had used it 3 times for board dinners. I knew that Renata Voss ran the accounts with precision, that the catering was done in-house and was genuinely good, that the acoustics in the main dining room were excellent, and that the venue had a private garden terrace that photographed beautifully in late afternoon light. I made 1 phone call, got Dominic a tour, and let him believe he had discovered it himself. He signed the contract for the rehearsal dinner space and a partial deposit on the wedding reception within the week. The contract was in his name. The deposit, $7,400, came from my account, because when Dominic called me 3 days after the tour to say that the deposit was a little steep right now and could I help, I transferred the money before he finished the sentence. He said he'd pay me back. I wrote it in the spreadsheet. I did not hold my breath. Over the following 10 months, as the wedding plans expanded and contracted and expanded again, for additional payments passed through Hargrove Hall's billing system. A revised food and beverage minimum when Celeste added 12 guests to the dinner list. An upgraded linen package. A damage deposit on the garden terrace. An additional hour of event staffing that Dominic decided he needed 6 weeks out. Every payment came from my account. Renata Voss processed each one. Her system logged the account holder's name on every transaction. N. Calloway. The total, as of the night of the rehearsal dinner, was $31,440. Dominic had repaid $2,000 of it, in one installment, 7 months earlier, following a conversation in which he told me he didn't want there to be any weirdness. I thanked him and updated the spreadsheet. The months leading up to the rehearsal dinner had a quality I can only describe as pressurized. Not because of any single event, but because of the accumulation of small ones. The way Dominic began referencing everything we've built together, meaning himself and Celeste, in a way that erased the support structure around them. The way my mother began parroting his language at family dinners, telling her friends that Dominic and Celeste had handled everything so independently. The way my father said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. I was invited to the rehearsal dinner as a guest, not as a participant in the wedding party. Celeste had 2 sisters and 3 college friends as bridesmaids. I was not among them, which was fine. Celeste and I were cordial but not close, and I had not expected it. What I had not expected was the seating chart, which placed me between 2 people I had never met, in a section of the table that the floor plan made clear was the outer ring of the event rather than its center. I noted it. I adjusted my expectations accordingly. I arrived on time, wearing a blue-gray wrap dress that I had bought for a client presentation and not yet worn. I introduced myself to Celeste's relatives at my end of the table. I answered questions about what I did for work with the abbreviated version I always use at family events. Financial analysis, mostly small businesses, nothing dramatic. Dinner was served in 3 courses. The first course arrived and was cleared. The second course arrived. Dominic stood up. He spoke for 4 minutes about how proud he was, how far he and Celeste had come, how grateful he was to everyone who had shown up for them. A phrase he used twice, with a particular emphasis that I understood was not directed at me. And then he looked at me and said what he said. She lives off us and calls it love. I found the eucalyptus arrangement. I held my gaze there. I took the sip of water. I stayed in my seat. Renata Voss, near the service entrance, was very still. I should tell you who Renata was beyond her professional capacity, because she matters to this story in a way that is not simply functional. She was 53 years old, had been with Hargrove Hall for 11 years, and had the particular quality of someone who has processed enough human events, weddings, memorials, corporate celebrations, retirement parties, to no longer be surprised by what people do to each other in decorated rooms. She had a quiet authority about her, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but that everyone in a professional setting eventually defers to. When she spoke, things happened. When she raised an issue, it was resolved. She had met me 4 times in person over the course of the event planning, twice for billing questions, once when I had come to the venue to confirm the linen upgrade with her directly since Dominic had miscommunicated the specifications to the decorator, and once, briefly, when I dropped off a corrected insurance certificate that the venue required and that Dominic had misplaced. She knew my name. She knew my face. She knew, because her billing system was meticulous, exactly which account had funded every transaction associated with the Callaway Marchetti event file. She was near the service entrance because she made a point of being present for the first hour of major events at Hargrove Hall. She said, when I asked her about this later, that she liked to see how the room felt when people arrived, whether the energy matched what the client had described they wanted. She had been watching the dinner go well, and then she had heard my brother say my name. After Dominic sat down, the room did a thing rooms do when something uncomfortable has happened in them. It reanimated, slightly too quickly, with the sound of silverware and poured wine, and conversations that started a beat too briskly to be entirely natural. Celeste touched Dominic's arm. He smiled at her. My cousin Priya, to my left, put her hand briefly on top of mine on the table, a small gesture she withdrew before anyone saw it. My mother said, audible from 3 chairs away, "He's not wrong that you've always done things your own way, Nadia." I picked at my fork. I finished my second course. I did not respond. Renata crossed the room. She did not approach dramatically. She moved with the particular efficiency of someone who has a professional reason to be anywhere in the building, and she came to stand at a point equidistant between Dominic's position at the table and the seat where I was finishing my dinner. She had her tablet with her, as she always did. "Mr. Callaway," she said. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to make sure I have everything correct before we close out the evening, since you'll be transitioning to the wedding reception account next week. I have your billing summary here if you'd like to review it." Dominic looked mildly irritated at the timing. "Can it wait until after dinner?" "Of course," Renata said. "I'll leave the summary on the table. The account holder column is highlighted. I noticed there may be a name on file that you'll want to update before the reception billing cycle begins. She set a single printed page face up on the table, to Dominic's right, where both families at the center portion of the long table could see it without effort. Then she stepped back to a professional distance and waited. Dominic looked at the page. The billing summary was a standard Hargrove Hall document, clean, formatted, institutional. It listed the event contract number, the service dates, the itemized charges, and in the rightmost column, for each transaction, the name of the account from which payment had been received. N. Calloway. N. Calloway. N. Calloway. N. Calloway. N. Calloway. 5-line items. Every payment. My name, printed in the same quiet font as everything else on the page, repeated down the column like a pulse. Dominic's jaw moved. Not a word came out of it. His future father-in-law, a man named Robert Marchetti, who was a structural engineer from a city 4 hours north, and who had thus far struck me as methodical and fair-minded, leaned slightly to his right to see the page. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. He simply looked at the column. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at Dominic. "Is this accurate?" Robert asked. His voice was level and genuinely curious, the way an engineer's voice is when he is confirming a specification before committing to a conclusion. Dominic said, There were some cash flows between us, it's not." "The account is registered," Renata said, from her position near the table's edge, "to Nadia Calloway. All 5 transactions. The total is noted at the bottom. $31,440, in the same quiet font." Celeste, to Dominic's left, had gone very still. She was looking at the page. She was not looking at Dominic. My mother's hand, which had been resting beside her wine glass, moved slowly off the table and into her lap. My father, at the far end of the table, picked up his water glass. He did not drink from it. He held it. I want to be precise about what happened next, because the temptation in telling a story like this is to compress the silence into something tidy. It was not tidy. It was 42 people at a long table in a beautifully appointed room, in the middle of what was supposed to be a celebration, realizing simultaneously that the architecture of the evening had just been rearranged. Dominic recovered first, in the way he always recovered, by attempting to reframe. "Nadia was helping out," he said. "That's what she does. She helps. And then it's not like she was." "You said she'd never contributed anything," Robert Marchetti said. He was still using the level voice. "To this family, I meant in a broader. To this event," Robert said, and gestured at the page. "She contributed $31,000. The number sat in the room the way a number with that many digits sits in a room, occupying space, requiring acknowledgement." Celeste said, very quietly, "Dominic." It was one word. It contained an entire conversation. I set my fork down. I aligned it with my knife. I looked at my brother for the first time since he'd made his announcement, and I said, in a register I had to work to keep even, "I don't need an explanation. I'd just like the balance returned before the end of the month." Dominic opened his mouth, closed it. His fiancée's father was watching him with the expression of a man recalculating. "The balance," I said, "is $29,440. I had the number ready, because I always have the number ready." Renata, with the discretion of someone who has seen exactly enough, gathered the billing summary from the table and returned to the service area. She had done what she came to do. She didn't wait for applause. Neither did I. What followed in the immediate minutes after was not a confrontation in any cinematic sense. There was no shouting. There was no overturned water glass. There was the quiet mechanical continuation of a dinner that no one at the table was fully present for anymore. Dominic's best man, a person named Kyle who had been largely silent throughout the evening, made an attempt at redirecting the conversation to the wedding weekend itinerary. It did not take. Celeste's mother Patricia leaned across the table to speak to her daughter in a voice low enough that I couldn't hear the words, only the cadence, which was the cadence of someone identifying a problem. My cousin Priya, beside me, said nothing. She poured me more water. My mother, 3 chairs away, said, "I think there may have been some miscommunication about the finances, and we should probably sort that out as a family." I looked at her. There was no miscommunication, Mom. There were 5 payments. There on the statement. She adjusted her napkin again. Well, Dominic didn't know the full picture. He knew I transferred the deposit, I said. He asked me to. He called me. I have the records. She did not respond to that. She picked up her wine glass instead. My father, at the end of the table, still had not put down his water glass. He was looking at the tablecloth in front of him with the expression of a man doing arithmetic.
Dessert was served.
Most people ate it. The event formally concluded 40 minutes later, with the kind of restrained wrap-up that happens when the room has collectively agreed to table the central topic until everyone is no longer in public. Dominic did not speak to me again that evening. As guests moved toward the exit and the coat room, I saw him in a low, taut conversation with Celeste near the terrace doors. Her arms were crossed. His hands were moving in the way they moved when he was explaining something he hadn't expected to have to explain. Robert Marchetti stopped beside me as I was getting my coat. He said, "I'm sorry that happened the way it did." He said it the way someone says something when they mean it and don't have anything to add to it. I thanked him. He nodded and walked to find his wife. Renata Voss found me near the exit. She handed me a business card, her direct line, and said, "If you have any questions about the account for the reception, please call me directly. The file is clear on everything." I thanked her. She shook my hand once, firmly, and returned to the room. I drove home on streets that were quiet at that hour, and I sat in my parked car for a while before I went inside, not because I was processing anything dramatic, but because the particular kind of tired you feel after years of quietly holding something up is different from regular tired, and I needed a moment to identify it. The next 8 days were the consequence cascade that Dominic had authored entirely by himself. It began that same night, in the low conversation near the terrace doors, though I only learned its content later. Celeste had asked Dominic directly, had he known I was funding the venue payments? He had said he'd known about the deposit, but not the full amount. She had asked whether he'd ever intended to repay me. He had said, of course, eventually when things settled. She had asked what eventually meant for $29,000. He had not had a clear answer. This conversation, I was told by Priya, who had it from Celeste's sister, continued through that night and into the following morning. By the time I arrived at my office on Thursday, the wedding was not cancelled, but it was, in Priya's phrasing, on a very short leash. Robert Marchetti, who was the kind of structural engineer who did not separate his professional habits from his personal ones, had apparently gone home and made a list of questions. He had questions about the event contract. He had questions about what else in the wedding budget had been funded by third parties. He had questions, more broadly, about his daughter's future husband's relationship with money and with truth. Dominic called me on Thursday afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. His message said he wanted to clear the air and that things had gotten complicated and could we talk. I listened to it twice and did not call back. On Friday, my mother called. She did not lead with an apology. She led with, "Your brother is going through a very difficult time, and I think you could help by being a little more understanding." I told her I was happy to have a conversation about the money when Dominic was ready to have it. She said I was making this about finances when it's really about family. I said the finances were part of the family. She ended the call. My father called on Saturday morning. This was unusual. My father did not make calls without a specific logistical purpose, and when I answered, he was quiet for a moment before he said, "I knew you were helping with some of it. I didn't know how much." 29-4, after the one payment he made, I said. Another pause. "I'll talk to him," my father said. I don't know exactly what my father said to Dominic because my father is not a person who reports on conversations. What I know is that on Monday, a transfer appeared in my account for $29,440 from Dominic's bank. No note. No accompanying message. Just the amount, precise to the dollar. I updated the spreadsheet. I marked the line item closed. Celeste and Dominic's wedding did go forward, 3 weeks after the rehearsal dinner, on a Saturday in early October, in Hargrove Hall's garden terrace, which photographed exactly as beautifully as I had told Dominic it would. I attended. I wore a different dress, A deep green one I found on a Tuesday evening when I decided I wanted something that had no associations with anything that had come before. I sat in the third row on the groom's side, which was where my ticket placed me, and I watched my brother marry a woman who, whatever else might be true about their life together, had looked at a billing statement and asked a direct question. I thought that was, at minimum, a reasonable beginning. The professional consequences arrived more slowly than the personal ones, but they arrived. Dominic worked in project coordination for a regional construction management firm, a job he had gotten for years prior through a reference from Gerald Pratt, who was also the attorney I had hired to handle my father's contractor recovery claim. Gerald moved in a particular professional circle, and Dominic's firm was one of his clients. I had never told Dominic this connection existed. I hadn't needed to. Gerald, for his part, said nothing to anyone at Dominic's firm about the rehearsal dinner. He didn't need to. Robert Marchetti, who was a structural engineer, had professional contacts in the same industry Dominic worked in, construction adjacent, project adjacent, the world of people who sign contracts and are expected to understand what they mean. Robert had, apparently, made a few calls in the weeks following the rehearsal dinner, not to damage Dominic, but to satisfy his own due diligence about the person his daughter was marrying. Due diligence is its own kind of consequence. I learned, through Priya, that Dominic's firm had quietly passed him over for a senior project coordinator role in November, a role he had been expecting. He did not know whether this was connected to anything. He may have been right that it wasn't.
He may not have been.
The professional world has a long and quiet memory for the gap between what a person says about themselves and what the documents show. What I know with certainty is that the $94,000 my father was owed from the contractor who went bankrupt was partially recovered, $61,000, through Gerald Pratt's contingency work, settled in the spring following the rehearsal dinner.
My father called to tell me.
His voice on the phone had a quality in it I hadn't heard in years, something that had been held very tightly for a long time and had been permitted, briefly, to release. I told him I was glad. I meant it. It is now 14 months after that rehearsal dinner. I still work in financial analysis. I have 7 clients of my own, including 2 I brought on in the past year, who were referred by Robert Marchetti, who had apparently decided, based on whatever assessment he'd made of me that evening in a decorated dining room, that I was someone worth referring. I did not ask him to do this. He did it without telling me, and I found out when a new client mentioned his name during our intake call. I have since moved to an apartment with a second bedroom that I use as an office, with a window that faces a courtyard with a linden tree that I did not know I wanted until I had it. My financial records are organized, as always. The spreadsheet that tracked 3 years of family payments is archived in a folder I don't open often but that I have kept because I believe in keeping records. I see my parents at major occasions. My mother and I have a relationship that operates at a particular temperature, not warm, not cold, functional. My father and I talk on the phone on Sunday mornings with some regularity now, and the conversations are different than they used to be. He asks questions about my work. He listens to the answers. It is not a transformation. It is a small, steady change, which is the only kind that lasts. Dominic and I are in contact, holiday messages, family dinners twice a year. He has not said anything that resembles an apology, but he has also stopped making speeches. I will take it. Someone asked me once, around the time all of this was landing, whether I felt vindicated. I had to think about it for longer than they expected before I answered. What I felt was not vindication. Vindication implies the other person has acknowledged they were wrong, and no one in my family has fully done that. What I felt was something quieter, the specific relief of having been seen for one moment by a document that could not be argued with. 5-line items. My name. The truth, in the same font as everything else. There is a difference between burning a bridge and simply declining to rebuild one with the same cracked materials. I did not stop helping my family. I became more deliberate about what help looked like, which is not the same as withholding it. I stopped making invisible the things I carried, not to get credit, but because making them invisible had allowed other people to construct a version of me that wasn't accurate, and I had let it stand too long. The spreadsheet stays open. The records are current. And every month, the bills I cover are documented, in writing, with a date and a purpose and my name on them. Not because I expect a fight. Because I believe that what you do for the people you love deserves to be true, and the truth deserves to be somewhere it can be found. What you carry in silence, someone else will eventually name for you, or a billing statement will. 14 months later, my father returned part of what I carried. Gerald Pratt recovered $61,000 from a contractor who owed it. Dominic's $29,440 hit my account on a Monday with no note and no drama. And Renata Voss processed the wedding reception payments, which came, this time, from a joint account in the names of Dominic and Celeste Calloway, without any issue at all. I know because I asked her. Here is what I keep coming back to, and I'd like to know if you've ever faced it yourself. There was a moment between the time Renata set that billing summary on the table and the time Robert Marchetti said the number out loud, where the entire room held still. If you have ever been the person at the table who has been carrying something quietly for a very long time, what did it feel like the moment the record spoke before you did? If this story reflected something you've lived, share it. Leave a comment. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and the next one is already waiting. I'm Nadia Calloway. The spreadsheet is closed. And I am no longer invisible.